Good afternoon. Thank you, MP Genius, for allowing me the opportunity to participate in this symposium. Much of my comments are going to be informed by the series of papers and op-eds that Wellington Advocacy is putting together in cooperation with MLI on international cooperation and advancing that new dynamics forward. So, international development alongside diplomacy and defense are key pillars of Canada's 3D framework for foreign relations. Currently, Canada is sixth largest donor country. We ought to have greater impact and influence across the global aid system and deploy such influence to advance Canadian interest at home and abroad. The global center of power is shifting. The rise of China, the growing influence of regional powers such as India, Saudi Arabia, Korea, Brazil, Turkey, create opportunities and threats to global stability and indeed Canada's security and economic prosperity. These new economies and rising political powers, along with the demographic transitions taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, are reshaping the international aid architecture. Canada can no longer afford to remain static in the face of these changes, and the current failure to strategically coordinate Canada's diplomacy, defense, and development efforts has meant that Canada's engagement in recent years has sadly had little impact. So the big question is, why is Canada struggling to find relevance? The answer, in my opinion, is due to the divergent principles on aid between Canada's approach versus emerging powers, and secondly, Canada's over-reliance on multilateral institutions, in this case, reliance on regards to international development. The incentives and objectives driving international development for many of these new development partners, especially China, is self-interest. In that sense, foreign aid is foreign policy, often channeled through bilateral rather than multilateral systems. It's tied to procurement of goods and services with less conditions and no transparency. On the other hand, international cooperation in Canada is largely thought as extending Canada's charity rather than a critical tool of statecraft. This approach seeks to advance global poverty reduction while playing down the use of aid to strengthen relations with developing countries to gain support for Canada's foreign policy objectives. To demonstrate a clear example of this thinking, a moderator just last week at the recent International Development Finance Forum here in Ottawa posed the questions to the panelists. If Canada owed developing countries in Africa a duty, responsibility to provide them with aid, the response was almost unanimous, with the panelists citing Canada's obligation to international commitments like the Paris Agreement and so forth. I don't think Canada owes developing countries a responsibility to provide them with aid. Rather, Canada owes a duty to advance global stability and to grow new markets for Canadian citizens and companies to trade their goods and services. In doing so, cooperating with developing countries, especially in Africa, is a strategic and economic imperative for Canada, which will support poverty alleviation while promoting Canadian interest. In advancing international cooperation, multilateralism for its own sake shouldn't be our North Star. The desire to merely seek to uphold the status quo and the fetishization of dialogues needs reevaluation. Our guiding light must be advancing Canadian interests in concert with addressing global issues. In the age of geopolitical competition, we can no longer take for granted that every multilateral organization is aligned with our national interests in our foreign policy goals. There is a mounting tension between West and its key allies, Asian allies, and the global authoritarian axis comprising of China, Russia, and Iran. We can no longer assume that the political differences with these multilateral systems are negligible. Canada has always been an advocate for multilateralism, and indeed we should continue to do so, because China and Russia do not seek to only redistribute global power, but they also want to change the basic rules that govern international cooperation. For these reasons, we need to reassess our values and policies that drive Canada's international cooperation. However, our engagement in multilateralism should not be guided by naive globalism. Becoming strategic in our engagement starts with a full review of Canada's international cooperation activities. Moving from multilateral engagements guided by slogans to what our colleague Baran has termed as unilateral cooperation, driven by small issue-based narrow groupings of like-minded states. This also means that we need to end duplicate mandates within global institutions. For example, Canada is a member of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was created at the end of the Cold War. Does it still make sense to be spending Canadian development money on Europe? Most Canadians will agree we no longer need to be a member of the European Development Bank, where Canadian international development funds are going to support oil and gas pipelines in Turkey and Russia. Equally, we should end our membership with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, aka the Chinese Bank for Global Influence, and stop representing China at the African Development Bank. I mean, how naive can it be that a major global competitor like China is represented by our executive director at the African Development Bank? This review should address the issue that Canada has developed an unfortunate reputation of being a nation that wants to be at every table, but is not a serious contributor at any table. Neither our allies nor our foes are buying what we've got to sell. And by all accounts, we currently don't seem to have much to offer, irrespective of the fact that Canada is back. We need to also start thinking of international cooperation as part of statecraft and not some sort of charity. Good intentions are not a substitute for clear goals and metrics to measure success. We have a real interest in a robust international cooperation program that advances projects that make real difference, but that requires that we have good reason to think that these projects will actually make a difference. So, conclusion, we need a new dynamic model for international cooperation that will prioritize partnerships with a broad array of non-profit and for-profit Canadian organizations, rather than trusting some levels of technocrats in global institutions to make all decisions for us. We need an approach that promotes the use of innovative financing models to de-risk market for Canadian investors and unlock the significant money that traditional grant-based funding has been wanting to do. This renewed approach should be one that looks beyond government to bring in the private sector, NGOs, faith groups, diaspora organizations in particular, in formulating and carrying out our renewed international cooperation strategy and moving forward to beyond state-to-state foreign aid. I will stop there and take questions.
Just under 2 minutes left.
So I agree with you in terms of the approach to a more bilateral approach to our global aid and actually building up financial models that actually empower nations in Africa, et cetera, to move forward. In terms of what you've observed vis-a-vis the nexus between Iran, China, Russia, which we've seen their development programs throughout Africa, undermining democracy, how do you think we as a democracy here in Canada should fight back and help nations in their development needs?
I think first and foremost, we need to realize that most of those partners that we work with in Africa, most of those countries, are a different approach to international development than we do now. And the attraction of China and Russia and Iran and Turkey is something that is of immense importance to them because they are all political entities trying to survive the next either coup or maintain their governments going forward. I think approach that we would take to help us regain footing in Africa would be to partner with this triangular cooperation. So look to work with countries like India, countries like UAE, to have third-party tripartite agreements to do work and support development in Africa. Secondly, I think if I were to make a suggestion to you, Garnet, and the MPs here, we need to move from this idea of having an Africa strategy to actually putting together a legislation that says Canada-Africa Strategic Cooperation Act that brings the whole of Canada into it, and not just development, but diplomacy, trade, security, people to people, social and cultural partnerships. We need an overall 360 approach to that. And if we did that, we will now become a player again in Africa. Thank you.